Hello everybody. So today I will be discussing an issue that I don't really hear people talking about, which is how white superiority during the British Raj affected years of cultural cosmetics. So white superiority has been and is still an issue in many South Asian countries for many years. However, I will specifically be discussing India because it is most notable due to the British Raj. So this research project will explain how the colonization of India brought in a new way of cosmetics to the Indian women, and how because of this colonization, white supremacy has historically influenced Indian women and how they physically perceive themselves, and stemmed a new part of the Indian culture of cultural doubt. So back in 1858, when the British Raj first began, due to the British Crown taking direct control of India, many British women were set to live in a new life in this foreign country and had to learn how to adapt into this new environment. Many British women during this time thought of the Indian women as oppressed or helpless and in need of this British intervention. This is because many, if not all, at the time believed that the British civilization was superior. Although many women had this mindset about Indian women, some genuinely admired the Indian women. For an example of this would be Fanny Parks. She was a woman who lived during this time, and she stated, "The Indian women are graceful, clever with their fingers, and cheerful in their domestic duties. I often envy the elegance with which they wore their drapery." This type of positivity towards South Asian women was somewhat rare, especially for the time period, but it still occurred from time to time. However, although there were some British women who admired Indian women, many did not, and because of this, over the years and years of the British Raj taking place, there became a Eurocentric beauty standard within the Indian culture and community. This beauty standard is still in effect today and has become even more prominent for Indian women and young Indian girls. This is because of advertisements in text and more modernly in media. This type of beauty standard was also mainly accessible to upper and middle class women who were able to afford to change their appearance, as lower class women, they didn't have the accessibility to do so. They didn't have the resources to do so. According to an article called Light Skin, Dark Legacy, How Colonial Beauty Standards Continue to Shape Colorism in India by Arish Ghazi, fair skin was highly prized in Europe, and this preference was soon imposed on India. The British aristocracy considered fair skin a sign of purity and superiority, a belief that quickly permeated Indian society. So fair skin, light hair, and blue eyes, they're not genetic features that women in South Asia possess. So because they weren't born with these features, there were many different ways that Indian women tried to achieve this. One of the most popular ones being skin bleaching. During weddings, also brides would often paint their faces a few shades lighter than they actually were to appear paler. This bridal makeup technique is also unfortunately still in effect today. It still somewhat happens. Another technique that the Indian women used was they would put turmeric onto their faces as well as lemon juice, and they did this because they believed that doing so would lighten their faces and facial features, which obviously, as we know now, does not work. Avoiding the sun was also another technique that they used, which was harder for lower class women to do because it was harder for them to stay indoors. But normally if you were upper or middle class, you would just keep out of the sun. You wouldn't really go into the sun. You wouldn't work hard outside. You wouldn't do any of that. But however, these techniques soon became problematic due to the fact that many women quickly realized that no matter how long they kept out in the sun for, or how many of the products they put on their faces, when they wiped it off, their skin was still darker than the European woman, which was the start of this beauty standard being more than just a physical aspect to them, but it changed into a mental one as well. So this physical beauty standard soon started to mentally affect many women in India. Instead of it simply being a beauty standard, many genuinely believed that paler skin was a sign of intelligence, and it was a sign of beauty and a sign of purity. This soon became the root of internalized racism for Indian women, which was carried out through generations upon generations and into the modern world. Fair skin was also tied to social mobility, and many women were afraid if they were not pale enough, or in other words, European enough, they wouldn't be able to secure a proper marriage, or they wouldn't be accepted into certain social circles, which in some ways that was true. Many people did exclude those who had darker skin from certain social circles. Unfortunately, that did happen. It is also important to note that Indian men at this time also associated fair skin with wealth and beauty, which further impacted the women's mental health and physical appearance, and heavily impacted internalized racism. This beauty standard was passed down from mothers to daughters, from grandmothers, mothers to daughters, and even from husbands to sons. It was everywhere. Another point to include was that it wasn't just makeup and face products that changed during this period of history, but also the clothing style. Instead of the traditional Indian clothing that had been worn for as long as India existed, many upper and middle class women and men began to wear blouses and petticoats, trousers and suits. And either way, even if they didn't wear any of that, they still somewhat incorporated some sort of Western clothing item into their everyday wear. This was because of the pressure of having to modernize themselves to fit the British ideal. And the women who adapted to these new clothing styles were seen as more educated and refined. So this standard of beauty became so popular and so normalized that the Indian women who did not participate in skin lightening, or the women who were too poor to achieve these Eurocentric beauty standards, were often looked down upon, because the pressure to fit these standards became more than just a personal matter. It became the social currency of India. It became the social currency to finding marriage and to be treated as an equal, which in itself is horrible, because it's one thing for somebody who's a different race than you to be racist towards you, and it's a completely another thing for someone of your own race to be racist towards you. Internalized racism is a real issue that's still going on, and unfortunately, it's very hard to get out of that mindset. In modern days, it is, and if not more prominent issue. Beauty standards, beauty products are often purposely put a few shades lighter, and many women are still looked down upon for having darker skin and keeping their darker skin. Internalized racism has rapidly grown within the Indian culture, and although it's starting to become more challenged recently, it is still an ongoing issue that is often overlooked. Although not all the blame could be put on the British, as colorism has been an issue in India very much before the British took over, but once the British did take over, it definitely intensified during the British rule, and even after it, because of the long-lasting effects the British placed after they left. So, as stated before, many Indian women and Indian men did resist these beauty standards as they were being introduced. So there are a lot of important movements, but one of them was the Swadeshi movement of 1905, and this movement basically promoted the use of cultural products rather than the ones the British had brought over, and it encouraged the celebration of Indian culture and identity and religion. Eurocentrism in India is an ongoing issue that many people ignore due to how normalized it has become, but truth is, it's still affecting more and more women every day. Some Indian women see having fair skin as their main goal in life, and that problematic mindset is spreading into new generations. Indian women need to be able to see that their skin color does not equate to being quote-unquote dirty and lower class, but it equals to as much beauty and purity as fair skin does, which unfortunately this was not taught to them during the British Raj. And unfortunately, it will also take more than just a few years to get rid of this standard in India, and realistically, it won't completely change. So an article, The Lives of Indian Women, a study into past and present influences of the British rule on Indian women in various sectors and industries in modern Indian society, by Mahima Pritmani, further explains this and how British colonists imposed Western ideals into Indian culture because of racism and the superiority complex that they had. So the British Raj was far more than just a time and period, a period in time in which the British governed over India. It was more than just British imperialism. It was a time in history in which Indian culture, Indian standards, and Indian society was altered completely, and was a time in which these Western ideals embedded themselves into a land that was looked down upon. These beauty standards didn't just alter the physical appearance of many young Indian girls, but also introduced a whole new idea of internalized racism and colorism that, again, is still unfortunately going on today, and has been a generational issue. And again, realistically, these issues won't just go away. These issues will most likely remain for many, many more years, but it is important to understand that the more you embrace your culture and the more you embrace your identity, the easier it is to see that these Western ideals, these Western beauty standards, they're just beauty standards. Before the British had taken over, although there was colorism that was still in India, the beauty standard was obviously fit for Indian women. It was ideal, it was realistic. It was, having softer facial features and body types. It was having, darker, tanner skin. It was having darker hair, darker eyes, rather than, what European women had, which was, pale skin, blonde hair, brown hair, and, blue eyes, and very sharp features. It's also important to note that the men during this period of time also greatly influenced this idea to Indian women. And although they also influenced it, they were also brought down upon. Many Indian men were, had to be quote-unquote educated differently. They had to wear different clothing. They had to act differently than how they normally would.